Welcome back, everyone. Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some truly foundational definitions from our source text, specifically focusing on Chapter 2, which is titled There is a Solution, along with some incredible insights from the subsequent chapters. We're going to ask you to just set aside any preconceptions for a moment, because we're looking at a very specific, clinical, and frankly, life-saving distinction made in the text. We're talking about the fundamental difference between a hard drinker and a real alcoholic. If you've ever tried to understand addiction, whether for yourself or just someone you really care about, grasping this specific contrast is absolutely crucial.
We've all heard the questions, right? Actually, you know what? You've probably asked them yourself. Things like, why can't he just handle his liquor? Or why doesn't she just drink like a normal person or quit altogether? People say his willpower must just be incredibly weak, or if she really loved me, she would just stop. And let me tell you, it is completely natural and incredibly common to feel this frustration. The text totally acknowledges these as commonplace observations, because from the outside looking in, the behavior is completely baffling. But before we systematically deconstruct these frustrations, we really have to validate them. It looks like a simple choice, but as you'll see, for a certain type of person, it is anything but.
Section 1. The willpower misconception.
So to really understand this, we have to realize that our commonplace questions stem from a total misunderstanding of how willpower actually functions in addiction. We're basically applying standard rules to a game played on an entirely different board. On the left side here, we have the hard drinker, and on the right, the real alcoholic. The text makes it incredibly clear that there's this invisible threshold separating the two. Understanding exactly where that line is drawn is the key to understanding why some people can just walk away and why others are dragged down.
Section 2. Profile of a hard drinker.
Okay, let's be very clear about this. A hard drinker is not someone who just has a casual glass of wine with dinner. We are talking about someone with a severe habit. They might drink enough to cause real, gradual physical and mental impairment. Their drinking might even be severe enough to cause them to die a few years before their time. They suffer, and they absolutely cause suffering for others. But here is the defining characteristic, the real takeaway. No matter how bad it gets, the hard drinker still retains the power of choice.
And here's exactly how that power of choice works in action. If a hard drinker is presented with a sufficiently strong reason, let's say their health begins to fail rapidly, or they fall head over heels in love, maybe they change their environment, or a doctor sits them down and gives them a stern life-or-death warning, they can actually respond to those high stakes. They can make the conscious decision to halt or moderate their drinking. Now, don't get me wrong, it might be difficult, it might be super troublesome, they might even need medical attention to detox safely, but ultimately, they can stop.
So the crucial point to remember here is this. For the hard drinker, human willpower and the basic instinct of self-preservation are still fully functioning tools. They can look at the negative consequences of their drinking, weigh them against the pleasure of the alcohol, and choose self-preservation. Their willpower might be stretched to the absolute limit, sure, but it is not broken.
Section 3. The real alcoholic.
Now, let's look at what happens when someone crosses that invisible threshold we talked about, where willpower becomes completely useless. The real alcoholic may have started off exactly like a moderate drinker, or even a continuous hard drinker. But at some stage in their drinking career, a fundamental shift occurs. And the grim reality of the real alcoholic is this. They completely lose all control over their liquor consumption once they start to drink. The power of choice, that exact mechanism that allows the hard drinker to stop when the stakes get too high, is just simply gone.
The text emphasizes a really profound bodily and mental reaction here. Once an alcoholic takes any alcohol whatever into their system, something happens that makes it, quote, virtually impossible for him to stop. The shared experience of literally countless alcoholics confirms this. The problem isn't just a moral failing, it's an abnormal reaction. They're dealing with what the text's corresponding doctor's opinion describes as an allergy of the body coupled directly with an obsession of the mind.
Section 4. The Jekyll and Hyde Effect.
This complete loss of control doesn't just mean drinking a little more than they intended. It brings about drastic, frankly terrifying personality changes. The text uses this iconic, chilling quote to describe the real alcoholic. He is a real Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When a real alcoholic drinks, they rarely just get mildly, happily intoxicated. No, they're almost always more or less insanely drunk. They do absurd, incredible, truly tragic things. They become someone completely unrecognizable to the people who love them most. Just look at this stark contrast. In their normal, everyday nature, the alcoholic might be literally one of the finest people you'd ever meet,
highly capable, sensible, well-balanced, with a really promising career and special abilities. They build up this incredibly bright outlook for their family. But while drinking, man, they can become incredibly dishonest, selfish, and dangerously antisocial. They seem to have a positive genius for getting drunk at exactly the wrong moment. They end up pulling the beautiful structure they've built right down on their own heads through a completely senseless series of sprees.
Section 5. A total loss of choice.
Let's dive into what is arguably the most baffling aspect of the real alcoholic: their total inability to learn from past consequences. These traits just compound and overwhelm the alcoholic's mind. Willpower? It's practically non-existent. They are unable, at certain times, to bring into their consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week or a month ago. And because of this, stakes and consequences simply do not matter in the moment of temptation. They are left with absolutely no defense against the first drink.
The text uses a truly brilliant analogy here. Think of it as the hot stove failure. If a normal person touches a hot stove and gets a nasty burn, their brain instantly creates a permanent automatic defense mechanism, right? They will never casually put their hand on a hot stove again. But for the real alcoholic, there is a complete failure of this kind of mental defense when it comes to alcohol. Even if the last drink literally cost them their job, their marriage, or even their freedom, the memory of that burn just fades. It gets completely supplanted by the insane idea that, hey, this time it won't burn me.
To further illustrate this insane repetition, the text offers the analogy of the jaywalker. Imagine a man who just gets a thrill out of skipping in front of fast-moving vehicles, right? He gets slightly injured, promises to be careful, but then does it again. Then he gets a fractured skull. He promises to stop. A week later, he breaks both legs. He loses his job, his wife divorces him, he even gets locked up in an asylum to mend his ways. The very day he gets out, he races in front of a fire engine and breaks his back. If you saw this man, you would absolutely say he is crazy. Well, for the real alcoholic, returning to the first drink despite guaranteed destruction is exactly the same baffling, insane behavior. Because of this complete inability to bring the memory of past suffering into consciousness when it matters most, we arrive at this terrifying conclusion from the text. The real alcoholic is completely without defense against the first drink. The problem centers right in their mind. They have lost the power of choice in drink, placing them entirely beyond human aid.
And you know, this reframes absolutely everything. The real alcoholic's condition is not a lack of character. It's not a moral failing or just a simple lack of willpower that they need to tough out. It is a distinct, fatal malady, a real illness of the mind and body that entirely removes their ability to stop on their own, no matter how desperately they wish to do so. Self-knowledge, fear, and high stakes, those things work perfectly well for the hard drinker, but they are utterly useless for the real alcoholic.
Which ultimately brings us to the big question. If you or someone you love has crossed that invisible threshold, if human willpower is completely non-existent, if the highest stakes in the world don't matter, and if self-knowledge cannot provide a defense against that first drink, then what on earth can? If human power isn't enough to save us, what is? That is the profound question the text leaves us with, and it beautifully sets the stage for the solution. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep exploring this incredible material with us.